Hi, I'm Mark. Today, let's talk about China and the US. To get straight to the point, I believe the US is currently outperforming China. We need to understand the areas where the US holds an advantage and then delve into the reasons behind this. Let's begin with some data. In 2023, the US had a GDP of $27.37 trillion, while China's was $17.89 trillion. This means the US GDP is 1.5 times that of China. What about population? China's population is over 4 times that of the US, so the per capita GDP in the US is more than 6 times that of China. China has always claimed to be a communist country, so you might think that even though China's per capita GDP isn't as high as the US, the income gap between people would be smaller. Unfortunately, it's not. According to data from China's national statistics, China's Gini coefficient in 2023 was 0.47. While the US has been around 0.43 in recent years. A higher Gini coefficient indicates greater income disparity. Although income inequality between the rich and poor differs significantly between China and the US, the United States doesn't fare any worse than China in terms of income distribution. While social media often highlights the plight of homeless people in the US, which is truly saddening, it's important to recognize that China also faces homelessness, albeit with less visibility. I believe that a country's economic base determines its superstructure. The US, being wealthier, has various advantages. For example, US military spending is 3 to 4 times that of China. This number is actually abnormal. It's expected to be higher than China's, but not by that much, given that the US GDP is only 1.5 times that of China. We will discuss this in a bit. The social welfare in the United States is much better than in China. An illegal immigrant can still get food and shelter without doing any work, which indicates that both the government and nonprofit organizations in the US are financially well off. Some people criticize such a welfare system for creating various problems, like a large number of lazy people in the US. Despite this, the per capita GDP is still 6 times that of China. US technology is also far more advanced than China's. In fields like semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and artificial intelligence, the US still has an edge over China. Chinese internet companies were doing well, but in recent years the stock prices of their giants like Tencent and Alibaba have plummeted. Baidu, which once compared with Google, now shows an increasing gap, and no one would compare the two companies anymore. China still has companies like Huawei and ByteDance doing well, but they have only formed regional advantages. Once they emerge, the US immediately strikes them down like playing whack-a-mole. China has its counterattacks, but the results show that US companies suffer much less damage than Chinese companies. Google was expelled from China, but its stock price has increased tenfold over the years. Another important point is the gap in international prestige and allies between China and the US. Chinese media often claim that China has many allies and the US has few, but this is not the reality. Many countries indeed have grievances against the US, but this does not mean they prefer China over the US. From a practical benefit perspective, the benefits the US brings to most countries outweigh what China can offer. If countries had to choose between the US and China, most would choose the US. Take Singapore, for example. It seems neutral and tries to balance its relations between the US and China. However, if forced to choose, I believe Singapore would side with the US, even though more than 70% of its population is ethnically Chinese. There are many other areas where the US is stronger than China, but I won't go into all of them. It's undeniable that the US is stronger than China, but why is the US stronger? Is it because the US has freedom, democracy, and human rights? According to the World Democracy Index, the US does rank higher in democracy than China. But is the US really that democratic? The Democracy Index defines the US as a flawed democracy, ranking at 30th and behind Mauritius, Uruguay, and Costa Rica. Despite ranking 30th in democracy, the US is still the world's leading power. This suggests that democracy is not necessarily the key factor behind the US's strength. If we view democracy as a measuring tool, the US's version may be considered average, yet it has played a significant role in establishing the US as the world's foremost power. This indicates that other factors should also be considered. Conversely, if we see democracy as a result of success, the US may not fully fit the description of the world's leading power. Does the US's strength stem from its respect for intellectual property? To some extent, yes. To illustrate, Let's consider a historical anecdote. In the 18th century, when the US was still in its infancy, it was a relatively weak nation with an economy primarily focused on agriculture and basic manufacturing. In December 1771, Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers of the US, submitted a report on manufacturing to Congress. In the report, Hamilton advocated for rewarding those who brought valuable improvements and secrets to the US. This put Europe, the industrial center of the world, at a disadvantage. American spies distributed Hamilton's report throughout Europe's manufacturing centers, attracting skilled workers to emigrate to the US. Once they arrived in the US, they could apply for patents and receive funding with slight modifications to existing designs. This was essentially an American version of the Thousand Talents Plan. The British said that spies prowled along the Thames, hunting for craftsmen, engineers, farmers, and laborers, guiding them to the US. It wasn't until American technology could compete with Europe that they began to protect intellectual property. This gave rise to Lincoln's famous quote, "The patent system added the fuel of interest to the fire of genius." Lincoln took office in 1861, after 70 years of such practices. Once the US became strong, it shifted its focus from stealing others' technology to protecting its own technology from being stolen. This emphasis on the protection of intellectual property became important. The protection of intellectual property can be categorized into two types, national and international. Safeguarding intellectual property within a country undoubtedly benefits its development. International protection also contributes to global development, but it may not necessarily favor the growth of less developed countries. Therefore, respecting intellectual property is partly why the US is stronger than China. As a latecomer, China faces significant difficulties in surpassing the US due to the barriers of intellectual property. This may challenge our understanding, but it is indeed true. Before developing their own patent laws, they took from Europe. China's relative weakness compared to the US can be attributed, in part, to its disadvantaged background. In modern terms, China's historical trajectory can be likened to having an insufficient original foundation. It transitioned from the Qing dynasty to the Republic of China, and then to the People's Republic of China. During the Qing dynasty, China faced defeats not only from Britain, but also from Italy, reflecting a challenging historical period. Despite its diligent efforts, China's progress in certain areas may be likened to a working-class background during its second generation, possibly requiring a third or fourth generation to truly rise. The United States, with the British Empire as its predecessor, benefited from the strong foundation laid by the empire. The British Empire had numerous powerful relatives in Europe, forming a robust family. These powers had overseas colonies, which the United States eventually took over. After World War II, the United States played a significant role in promoting the independence of various colonies, establishing itself as the sole legitimate successor of the powerful family. In comparison, China does not have the same historical advantage. The United States can be seen as the son of the wealthiest family, benefiting from various funds, technologies, and talents that Europe sent its way. Moreover, Britain's status as the leading global power contributed to the widespread use of English as the most spoken language worldwide. Language is actually a powerful magic that can bring people together. For example, on a tour, as a person who knows some English, would you prefer to sit with English-speaking tourists or Spanish-speaking ones? Some countries like North Korea, South Korea, and Vietnam intentionally distanced themselves from China upon their founding to prevent their people from getting too close. If the public speaks Chinese, it becomes easier to conduct business, make friends with Chinese people, or even consider moving to cities like Shanghai or Beijing. If foreigners learn Chinese, it becomes more convenient for Chinese propaganda to spread. When China exported revolutions in the past, it often targeted Chinese-speaking regions. Today, if we observe color revolutions and equality movements, we'll find that their leaders generally have good command of English. In recent years, China has witnessed several large-scale protests. But why haven't these protests achieved significant outcomes? One reason is China's strict regulations, and another is the poor English proficiency. Due to Britain's historical power, it helped establish English as a global language, benefiting the United States significantly. In contrast, China's previous decline in national power led neighboring countries to seize the opportunity to de-Sinicize. Now, China is just starting to promote Chinese language and culture through Confucius Institutes, which is already too late. English has become an almost monopolistic language. For most countries, the cost of abandoning English to learn Chinese is too high. Even if China's national power surpasses that of the US one day, replacing English as the dominant global language would take a very long time. Another significant influence that Britain had on the US was its governance system, particularly the concept of separation of powers. Prior to the formation of the United States, Britain had already gone through a significant trial and error process to refine the system. While not perfect, it was considered the best in Europe during that time. Since the US shares a common origin and heritage with European countries, it required only minor adjustments to adopt this system directly. Now let's consider China. China's original system comprised imperial strategies, Confucian-mentioned doctrines, and the 8 banners of the Qin dynasty. These were rudimentary governance methods that clearly divided people into classes. While there were certainly some advantages, the disadvantages outweighed them. If we compare the government systems of the two countries to two families, one is like a working-class family, and the other is like a wealthy, second-generation family. A second-generation wealthy person starting a business gets financial support from their family and benefits from valuable management experience. On the other hand, someone from a working-class family starting a business can't expect material support from their family. Asking for experience is pointless. The family might at best warn them of the risks and suggest a safer career, like becoming a nurse or a teacher. Without knowing which path to take, China went through a long trial and error phase after its founding. Even great leaders like Deng Xiaoping only dared to cross the river by feeling the stones. It wasn't until Jiang Zemin's time that China roughly figured out the right path. So it has only been about 40 years. In contrast, the US has been steadily following the path designed by Britain for over 200 years. So isn't it natural for China to be weaker than the US? Besides having a good original family, the US also has very friendly neighbors. When the US was first established, it only had the 13 states on the East Coast, but it was very lucky. The local Native American neighbors were exceptionally friendly, giving their land and lives to the US, for example. Mexico in the South gave a lot of land to the US. New Mexico, for instance, was taken during the Mexican-American War. In the North, there is a good neighbor, Canada, which is so close that it almost wants to join the US. All of America's neighbors are good neighbors. China's neighbors are different. After China's founding, the Soviet Union to the north and China once stationed millions of troops, almost leading to a major war. North and South Korea are troublesome. To the southwest is the complex nation of India. To the south is Vietnam, and to the southeast is Taiwan. Further out at sea, there's Japan to the northeast, and a bunch of countries in the South China Sea to the south. With such neighbors, isn't it exhausting? Of course, it's normal for a country to have some disputes with its neighbors, like England and France or India and Pakistan, who have fought for many years. China's situation is actually normal, but the US is exceptionally fortunate. It has no neighboring country that can restrain it, allowing it to develop peacefully. This is definitely one of the reasons why the US is stronger than China. So far, we've discussed external conditions. When it comes to internal factors, the US has advantages too. The US has better natural conditions than China. China's land area is 9.6 million square kilometers, and the US is 9.83 million square kilometers. Although their sizes are similar, China is less robust. China's arable land is 1.28 million square kilometers, while the US has 1.65 million square kilometers. Besides arable land, the US has the world's second largest total natural resource reserves, just after Russia, but it has the world's highest resource productivity. This is because Russia's extraction capabilities are currently poor. Historically, at its peak, the US produced 80% of the world's copper, over 70% of its aluminum, and more than 50% of its iron. Today, the US produces about 25% of the world's natural gas, which not only meets its own needs, but also supports Europe. The US is also the world's largest oil producer, nearly self-sufficient, and able to export some. In contrast, China suffers from insufficient self-sufficiency in many important resources except coal and rare earths. The US also has a spiritual advantage. The early British settlers in America were largely Puritans persecuted in Britain. Puritan culture is a branch of Christian culture. We don't have time to go into detail today, so let's briefly summarize. Firstly, Puritans worked hard to earn money, which is rare in any religion. Puritans believed that working in the mundane world was God's arrangement. Puritan leader Preston wrote in his works, "If someone asks how to know God's will for him, my answer is simple. Just look at the wealth God has given him. The wealthier you are, the closer you are to God." At the same time, Puritans had to control their desires and live a holy and rational life. Why earn so much money? To help God exercise his authority, show love to God's people, and donate their wealth to receive eternal love. It's a closed loop. Homeless people in the U.S. can always get food, partly due to the Puritan culture. American Puritans were somewhat different from their European counterparts. Fleeing from Europe's oppressive religious environment, they naturally desired freedom. This freedom encompassed many aspects, including the freedom to migrate. As a result, the U.S. has very relaxed immigration policies. However, this isn't just due to cultural reasons. There are also practical benefits. The American people, influenced by this culture, are very open to new immigrants. This openness, combined with the U.S.'s strong national power and the global dominance of English, gives the U.S. a significant population growth advantage over China. According to a report by the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, 3.7 million illegal immigrants entered the U.S. in 2021, 4.8 million in 2022, and 6.2 million in 2023. In these years, the U.S. economy was not doing well, but the U.S. government intentionally increased the number of illegal immigrants. Over 3 years, 14.7 million strong laborers entered the country. In comparison, China had only 9 million births in 2023, and it would take at least 16 years to develop these children into productive workers. Chinese people might be very sensitive to the word illegal, but this reflects the different legal definitions between China and the U.S. In China, illegal immigrants are surely deported. In the U.S., illegal immigrants can work normally, and the police generally do not bother them. The difference is that illegal immigrants do not pay taxes, but also do not receive social benefits. Most illegal immigrants do low-end jobs that do not compete with most Americans for jobs, providing cheap labor to the U.S. These illegal immigrants need to eat, drink, and use other services, thereby contributing to the U.S. GDP. So, these 14.7 million people have increased the U.S. population by over 4%, potentially boosting GDP by 2%. Some low-income, physically laboring Americans are indeed dissatisfied with such immigration policies, but more Americans benefit from it, even if they do not speak out. Otherwise, how do you think the Democratic Party, with its lenient immigration policies, often manages to stay in power? In contrast, China cannot adjust its population issues as easily as the U.S. population represents both productivity and consumption power. If a country wants to become a superpower and resources allow, it should have a large population. The more, the better. The U.S. is also incredibly lucky. After its founding, the U.S. adopted a neutral attitude towards European countries. The European powers fought among themselves for a century. Having no time to suppress the U.S. instead, they needed the raw materials and low-end manufactured goods provided by the U.S. By 1894, the U.S. GDP was already the highest in the world. This situation continued until 1914, when World War I broke out, causing another major internal struggle in Europe. The U.S. did not join the war initially, but instead quickly developed its manufacturing industry and profited from the war. It joined the war later, reaping the final benefits and emerging as a victorious nation. After World War I, the U.S. was already the world's strongest nation, but it continued to stay low-key. After the war, U.S. manufacturing grew rapidly, leading to overproduction, which indirectly caused the Great Depression in the 1930s. Then luck came again with the outbreak of World War II. There's no need to elaborate much on World War II. In the early stages, the U.S. focused on reducing its stockpiles. For instance, much of the steel Japan used to attack China was imported from the U.S. Later, the U.S. joined the war again, completing another round of gains. At this point, the U.S. felt it was the right time and officially declared itself the world's leading power, demanding that others follow its lead. So isn't it natural for the U.S. to become the world's leading power? It started with a high foundation, lack of regional constraints, had favorable natural conditions, and its value system was better than that of the old European aristocracy. Combined with incredible luck, success was inevitable. Unlike traditional powers, the US did not stop after rising to the top. Many old empires, like ancient China, declined due to such complacency. Once it became the world's leading power, the US promoted the globalization of the dollar by leveraging its strong military, ensuring major commodities were priced in dollars, and outsourcing low and mid-end industries. The US linked the economies of major countries to its dollar system. This dependency allows the US to make these countries rich or poor at will, making it challenging for them to surpass the US while relying on the dollar. The US itself can continually print dollars, distributing its domestic costs globally. For example, how can the US afford such high military expenditures? The US military spending as a percentage of GDP is much higher than China's because it can print dollars. It needs a strong navy to ensure the dominance of the dollar. Why can the US afford to support so many homeless people, while China cannot? Because the money to support these beggars comes from the whole world. If China could internationalize the RMB like the US does with the dollar, do you think its immigration policies would loosen? Absolutely. Everyone pays, and I get the benefits. China, as a follower in this domain, lags significantly. Catching up is much more challenging now than when the US originally established these systems. Why? Because the US has an even greater advantage: shamelessness. This is not meant as a criticism. China often strives to present itself as a moral exemplar, whereas the US is less concerned with such perceptions. The US has indeed become the world's leading power, donning suits and ties, but when it feels threatened, it is willing to use aggressive tactics, whether against adversaries or allies, adults or children. Take the TikTok incident, for example. TikTok is a short video platform that outperformed American competitors, prompting the US to pressure it into selling its business to an American company. It's like finding out someone else's wife is prettier than your own and forcing her to be your lover. Isn't it clear why the US often succeeds? In comparison, China still has a long way to go. The rise of the US as the world's leading power was no accident. It resulted from a blend of favorable timing, geographical advantages, and human factors. China's challenge to surpass the US is far from straightforward. Not only is it difficult to overtake the US, but the gap between the two may even widen. This doesn't necessarily mean China is doing poorly. It's just that the US is very strong. China has already reached a remarkable level in just a few decades, drawing significant attention from the US, which is an achievement in itself. As the saying goes, those who aspire to greatness must not only have exceptional talent, but also unyielding determination.